And to welcome everybody to the second session of the day in this mini conference of our network, COST network. The topic for this afternoon first session is, of course, appropriation. Please bear with me if you are with us since the beginning. I need to repeat some things, just that we're all on the same page, but also for the people who are just around this time able to join, given everybody's busy schedule. Let me remind everyone that all the sessions are recorded, the sessions alone with the Q&As, in order to be posted on our website and be accessible and online for members of our group that haven't been able to participate today, but also to disseminate it with the wider public and use them. Some ground rules just to make that as interactive as possible, but also as efficient and as respectful as possible. Please keep your mics muted and unmute them when you need to have a question. Please, for questions, because sometimes either me or Sonia, we cannot see every face on the screen. Please send us a quick chat just to me or to Sonia, even just a question mark. Even just say, I have a question and we're going to give you the stage. But because if you're just raising your hands and you're trying to express something, we're not sure we're going to catch it. It worked really well in the morning session, so it should work again well. And please be very careful with the times. Sara, I'm going to give you 2-minute warnings. I'm sure you're not going to need it, but just in case, I'm sure all the statement participants and the responders will also keep their 5 minutes sharp timing. And accordingly, we're going to guide the Q&A. Sonia and Vili are going to be taking minutes, so if you see them concentrated on another screen, don't worry, but we just need to record the beautiful things you're saying. And I think that's all. And please make sure that when you finish a statement or a question, make sure that we understand it's done by a thank you or I'm done, because sometimes with Zoom, there's like some time delay, and we speak on each other and all these difficulties of a non-actual real embodied interaction. And on that, I'm going to stop sharing for now. I'm going to briefly introduce by reading a short bio by our second keynote speaker for the day. And Sara, thank you so much for assisting us in that front and for so willingly offering to take this role in such a short notice. Dr. Sara Santos Cruz is an assistant professor at the University of Porto, Special Planning and Environment Design, and a senior researcher at CITTA, I hope I pronounced it correctly, yeah. Research Center for Territory, Transport and Environment. Her research interests focus on urban design, development and management, and in particular, she does research into the urban space and processes that shape it, its social and psychological significance, meanings and values of public spaces, agencies of urban change, and implications of urban change for the communities, and actually certain vulnerable groups and for the environment. And without further ado, Sara, the stage is yours. You can share your screen. Thank you very much.
Okay. I hope you can see it. Yeah, it's okay.
Perfect.
So, hi everybody. First, I would like to thank the invitation to come here and to present to you. I must say that I come from urban planning, as I was saying, from the Faculty of Engineering, in fact, and so my approach can be a little bit different. The challenge that Sonia and Angeliki presented me was to explore and reflect on this topic. And sorry, let me just do something here. Okay. No, I think it's working because I have to. Okay, sorry. So I will just start with a poem by Fernando Pessoa that says, I don't know how many souls I have. I've changed at every moment. I always feel like a stranger. I've never seen or found myself. From being so much, I have only soul. Attentive to what I am and see, I become them and stop being I. I am my own landscape. I watch myself journey. Various, mobile and alone, here where I am, I can't feel myself. Here Pessoa is confused and confuses us. He's lost in his own identity. As individuals, we have multiple and dynamic identities, and the landscape or environments affects our feelings, perceptions, and ultimately our identities in our journey. The exchange between the I and them or outside world influences and builds our own identity. On the other hand, the city itself has an identity or multiple identities. By being appropriated by so much people, the question is how many souls the city has. But let's start with some introductory concepts. First, the meaning of appropriation, and it means to make one's own. Appropriation is then the act of taking something for your own use, usually without permission. The term appropriation can be found in different domains with different meanings. Let's look at two, one from cultural studies and the other from urban studies and environmental psychology. Cultural appropriation is defined as the adoption or taking of specific elements such as ideas, symbols, artifacts, images, art, rituals, icons, behavior, music, styles, and so on, of one culture by another culture. Whereas urban appropriation takes us to the feeling of possessing and managing a space irrespective of its legal ownership for its everyday use or as a means of identification. According to Rogers, cultural appropriation can be placed into 4 categories that emphasize both social structure and power relations. Cultural exchange refers to the reciprocal exchange between cultures with roughly equal levels of power. Cultural dominance, where one culture imposes onto a subordinated culture, highlighting here the symmetries of power between cultures. And cultural exploitation, when taking a subordinated culture for the benefit of the dominant culture without compensation. And lastly, the transculturation, where cultural elements are created from or multiple cultures, creating new hybrid forms. The idea of an enriching transformation by exchange of elements, values, customs, practices, and ideas is usually set aside as the debate on cultural appropriation demonstrates the imbalance of power that still remains between cultures. The term dominance implies here manipulation and control of values and symbols by a subordinated culture. These debates on appropriation appear in various cultural expressions from arts, literature, to music and fashion. More specifically, appropriation has a long history in art. Gothic churches were built on Roman churches. Picasso once said, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." Appropriation is then intentional borrowing or copying or alteration of existing images and objects. It may vary from being acceptable to be considered plagiarism, like in humanities and literature. Although there is this old saying that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and thus you appropriate because you appreciate, as in some cultures like the Chinese, our Western society tend to condemn all forms of imitations and copies, questioning where stands creativity, authenticity, and originality in art production. However, art implies more than a transformative process of using, borrowing, and mixing ideas, images, and values. It implies to manipulate, give new meanings to what gave inspiration. When we move to the urban context, the term appropriation gains a new mood. Going back to Lefebvre, it is the typical human action when people exert their right to the city and the street as a space of encounters. Or looking at Delors' definition, it is the whole series of psychological processes of creating, relaxing, acting, dreaming, or learning according to one's desires and projects in cities. Or lastly, as the process by which human beings constantly, consciously or unconsciously reclaim that space by doing something in a certain place. Many other definitions appear among the literature, but these concepts lead us to 4 points: space and territory, social and relational, informal and spontaneous, and affective and identitary. And I will start by the first one. So it's the notion of how humans relate to space, or more precisely, the biological need to define territories. Human territoriality reflects a biological characteristic, is then about instincts, driven by a need to claim and defend the territory. Some authors argue that people learn this sense of territoriality through their past experiences and their culture, which show them the social significance of space. Others see it as the outcome of an interaction between social and biological processes. Thus, besides the instinct, more complex forms are regulated through social frameworks. Second point is the idea of space as social construct, as we all know. Let's think about Henri Lefebvre, David Harvey, Doreen Macy, and others, where space is a social product or a complex social construction based on values and the social production of meanings, which affect spatial practices and perceptions. Space, as conceived by Doreen Macy, is constructed in a relational way, and it is this characteristic that allows for a continuous production and reconfiguration of meanings. In this perspective, appropriation rises as spontaneous acts and practices in a manifestation or part of a struggle for the right to the city. The third point relates to how appropriation suggests a degree of informality and spontaneity. By fitting in the category of informal act, it should follow characteristics of the right side of this table. Informal appropriations occur when originated by the creativity or desire of people, being spontaneous, sometimes illegal, not regulated, and based on experience, as opposed to formal appropriations that are planned for a certain space and where the possibilities of use are usually indicated by built environment. To speak about appropriation is also to speak about change. Change or transformation has been an important issue when studying public space. It is essential to determine, as suggested by Kevin Lynch, how manipulable the site is, or how difficult it is to be transformed. In a sense, manipulability refers to the freedom of the users to alter the setting to their own uses. And a second point, how reversible are the changes once they are made? Reversibility relates then to the freedom of future users. If changes made by previous users restrict future users. There's also this contribution by Frank and Stevens that classify types of spaces being appropriated according to their capacity and nature of these appropriations. Classification on open-ended spaces when they are flexible and adaptive, allowing for being discovered and allowing for more creativity. The found spaces when people identify certain characteristics that allow this appropriation, but spaces were not designed as such. And the boundary and liminality spaces, the appropriation emerges by proximity between the private and closed space and the public space. Furthermore, it is inevitable to refer various kinds of informal urbanisms that have been emerging worldwide. The pop-up urbanism, tactical urbanism, do-it-yourself, and other forms of placemaking. These interventions can look like parking space converted into a mini park, man-made public spaces, sidewalk gardens, and pop-up markets, to name just a few. They are essentially citizens taking city planning into their own hands through small-scale transient projects meant to enhance their lives and their neighbors' lives. They fit into a pattern of citizen activism and limited public funding, where communities have responded by taking matters into their own hands with the aim of improving short-term urban issues, but with long-term goals. These acts are seldom totally spontaneous, as they need some previous preparation and planning. Often, they follow and import examples and experiences from other contexts. The fourth and last point refers to the affective dimension. Research on this topic started early in the 70s, mainly in environmental psychology studies. And here, once again, the definition of Cruz that appropriation of space is understood as a feeling of possessing and managing a space irrespective of its legal ownership for its everyday use and as a means of identification, or that it is a way of interiorizing space or associated to personal identification, as with Proshensky. As said, appropriation does not entail possession or property ownership, in the sense that I do not need to be the owner of an urban space to be able to appropriate it. I appropriate it, but the city also appropriates me in a process that always operates both ways, or at least should be. It is based on identification, whether or not reality is changed. The psychological processes relate to urban cultural practices, perceptions, representations, aesthetics, and feelings. They involve the social and personal imaginary, the bond between the individual and the place. In this interactive process, individuals purposefully transform the physical environment into a meaningful place, while in turn transforming themselves. Appropriation is then this mechanism by which place attachment and place identity develops. Examples can include appropriation as part of daily practices, where certain public places are an extension of the house, probably due to limitations in the private space. A certain place becomes the place where clothes are to be dried. It can also include the elderly playing cards every afternoon as a routine in their daily life. As a place of encounter, the square is appropriated by the old men. They adjust the urban furniture according to their needs, turning the place into a more comfortable place. In this case, they often use wood boards to modify the stone tables and benches that exist there. This is the square where you know you will find the elderly playing. Sometimes they have their own corner. They take the chairs and tables and wind protection, and they position themselves according to weather conditions. Another example takes us around Casa da Música in Porto. Probably Rem Koolhaas never imagined the space around the concert hall building would turn into a skate park, where kids join and play with skates because of a lack of a proper skate park in the city. Or the example of graffiti that can also be a form of appropriation in the walls. Although physically those that appropriate are not present, their intentions, their signatures and art prints stay in the walls, and the walls become their space. But appropriation can also be forced and without permission, challenging the rules of acceptable appropriation. People pulled to use the street, transforming the public as their own house, bringing all they have, all the corner has all the meaning to them. Other examples are the parklets that emerge everywhere. Here, the intention is to appropriate a parking lot to other purposes in order to give a message to those that manage spaces. Design may vary, but great similarity can be found in diverse locations on multiple users, like a replication of this kind of events. The last example refers to events that may happen everywhere, like this one of yoga classes. A massification and replication process takes place in these events, misleading the concept of true appropriation by the citizens. Some of these temporary appropriations are memifications with just ephemeral significance, where people are subordinated to the will of those that impose a certain kind of action in the city. There are thus different forms of appropriations with different purposes, more or less spontaneous, more or less permanent, more or less participative, more or less meaningful. We should not question or judge the relevance of each, I think. People have these multiple perspectives and points of view. about what they want to do, what they need to do, and what they can and are allowed to do in urban spaces. These acts represent own statements, but are also stories that take place in the public arena, with people playing as actors. We could look at the examples and find that there is exchange and dominance also in urban appropriation. Exchange, if the bond people place is balanced and reciprocal, but also dominance if appropriations are dominated by other values and power and control comes in between. Subversive intentions ruins the affective dimension and true meanings, or at least threats, questioning the authenticity of the act of appropriating. Interventions transform the space for other purposes, but appropriations should manipulate the space to each own's purpose, stressing affections and feelings and people writing stories in urban places. The identity or identities of the city is then built upon these meanings. And to conclude, I just want to say what Paul Ricoeur told. The self is essentially a fiction through which we understand our lives as coherent narratives. Well, appropriation allows us to write certain stories of our life through urban places, but at the same time, and creating meaningful places in the city and developing narratives through the city. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. I did tell you you're not going to need your warning. You're perfect on time.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much. Not only for such a concise, very well put, very holistic presentation of the term. Imagine if you were part of the cost network earlier, and if you were coming from the same field as you were worried in the beginning. But also I want to thank you, because 2 weeks ago when we had the internal working group 2 meeting, appropriation was one of the terms that gave us the most, I think, challenge, if I put it that way, because of its many different understandings, and not to polarize things, but some more darker, more negative, some more positive. And you already said it's not about judging them, so I'm not taking the conversation there. But it's as if you're putting all together a number of our concerns as a working group too. Yeah. Thank you very much.
If I have the time, I could also start by just provoking one question, which would be one thing that I hadn't bring to the presentation, and which is time. Where stands time in appropriation? And I think it's just a suggestion for debate, because I haven't included very much time here, but I think it's important, the time issue, the time we spend, the moment. So I think it's also a very important variable. You know, we start thinking of what we should include, and then we realize, oh, this should be something I should also have included maybe. So maybe we can also start by that one, if you don't have any other questions.
Absolutely. If there already want to take up this challenge and think about time in appropriation, or any questions or any comments.
If I may.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, very interesting, this aspect of time. And of course, in my response, I would talk very, very briefly about that. But in the projects that I follow, it's very true that even if the time, there's different times. For example, I find there's a time of the space, there's a time of the appropriation, but then there's a time of the actors. And I have stories where the appropriation is really planned for just 6 days, and it takes 2 years to plan that appropriation. So there's this very interesting, where do you measure the time, in which part of that appropriation you measure the time. Done.
Dalia, perfect, following the rules. Dalia, what do you mean appropriation has been scheduled for 6 days, but it takes, give us a more concrete example.
Okay, there it was, well, I will show an image later, but there was an abandoned plot, and this person, she wanted to transform that plot into kind of a playground for children. And to do that, it took like 2 years of planning first to think, where do we get funds to do that? How do we make a project out of that? Who will help us to participate in that? Then it's a really beautiful story, because then they went through a whole process of learning to have empathy for children, and learning to how the space should be for children. You know, I think it's a very beautiful story also to tell architects a little bit about. And then, but the idea was, it's going to be, actually it was planned for 10 days, but then it rained and then it was closed. And that's the end of that story, or the beginning of new stories. But yeah, that's that's a concrete story.
Thank you very much. Please, the stage is open for questions or comments.
Thank you, Sara. It was a very, very clear and informative lecture. And I thank you also for making the distinction between cultural and urban appropriation. And within that,
and actually tomorrow I defend my PhD candidacy. So I don't have
something.
Yeah, I just muted the candidate participant, so I think that has solved the problem.
Okay. No, I think it was very helpful to distinguish all these different levels of appropriation, and to be clear that there's indeed, it could be very positive in terms of exchange and giving another meaning to a place, and also giving or having some kind of ownership by a particular group. But then again, there's also this aspect of the manipulative aspect, or the dominance. So I think it was very interesting how you were able to distinguish all these different levels, and thereby also opening up the discussion about well, which aspects of appropriation are we actually looking for within our group.
I also enjoyed very much in the presentation some kind of an underlying probably thought that it's kind of an unavoidable thing, that the development of things are based on some degree and some kind of appropriation. When you're talking about the Gothic churches, part of the Roman churches, and how cultures and history develops, there is always an integrated appropriation part that can have political or social or casual or more official characters, but it's always an unavoidable part of the process of this development over time. A necessary, a really structural one.
Yes, and how values and our traditions, our cultures affect the way we appropriate and what we appropriate. So our daily life, our practices, our everyday practices in public spaces are influenced by that. And some are just using the space, but others are appropriating because they have this other intention of having the public space as their own. And that's what I think, in my view, from what I read also, it's what distinguishes the appropriation from the use of the public space. So, but it's difficult sometimes to distinguish both. What is just using public space and where becomes the appropriation of something that is public. So where is this boundary? And also what is allowed to be done as appropriation in the public space. So what are the forces that dominate and that kind of conditions our appropriation of public spaces? Either they are more cultural, or they are more institutional, or they are just like the ownership of the space. So and that's also important to see where are these boundaries of controlling the space and what we have freedom to do, and at the same time, what are the dominant forces? That's why I think these two keywords, the exchange that comes in this process of appropriation and dominance, appears in different completely different perspectives. We can understand it in different ways. Dominance of power, dominance of control, but also dominance of values, of cultures that condition our way of appropriating the space.
I think it was a...
Saskia and Susanna.
Oh.
No, Saskia, I can see that there's a question, right? Or somebody else?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Sarah. I really liked your talk, and gives me a good reason to come back to my what seems to be my hobby horse now. Can you say a little bit about the physical qualities of the space that? Well, let's put it otherwise. Dalia was giving an example which she specifically said it was a leftover space. So that's why those people thought they could turn it into a playground. So it is a space that people thought, well, nothing's happening there, so I can do anything I like, probably, because it looks like leftover. But of course, so how much could we as designers or as researchers of the urban landscape say about what are the existing qualities of the space that could invite appropriation or steer or allow for? Could you say something about that?
I can go back to Kevin Lynch that said that the space should be manipulable. So there should be this freedom of the user to feel it as their own and be able to transform it. But also there are indicators, or at least some assets or elements of the public space that invite us to do certain things, like the benches or like the tables or like the urban furniture that we find in spaces that condition our uses of that space. But that's use when you change it, transform it, and give something from you to that space. I think then we have the appropriation, because you turn it into something else, or at least the use is has another meaning, and probably that's when start is appropriation.
Could it also be something about?
Does it make sense?
I'm just thinking now, because I really liked your example of the old people who had the stone benches and they were uncomfortable, so they put on top of it. So could it also have something to do with our earlier discussion on meaning, that if we make it places not really geared for ultimate comfort, if they're slightly uncomfortable, then it invites for appropriation, because then you want to make it comfortable for yourself.
But then it's also a message to those that manage the space. It's also a message that something has to be done in that public space. So sometimes these appropriations are also forms of giving the message to those that manage or have the power to change the space.
Any other questions?
May I add something?
Please.
I'm from the transportation realm also, and appropriation could be a battlefield. When you think about public space in between pedestrians and motor car owners. So what's your view of this kind of appropriation as a battlefield? It could be legal or illegal. It could have many forms: marking, making obstacles, making barriers, and so on. But it's a really battlefield. That's
maybe then we go back to the keyword of conflict between the different users of space, right? And how we manage these different actors in public space.
in my country, we have also a problem sometimes because our population is aging as in the rest of Europe, and some places belong or some groups try to grab this kind of streets. It may be youngsters, it may be older populations, because these different groups, they have different ideas how to use the space. So they make obstacles for the other groups. It's also a problem for town planners how to solve these problems for conflict. I know if it's the same in your country, but in my country, is now it's very hard task for us in some places.
Karel, may I ask what country you're talking, where country you're coming from? Sorry.
It's Czech Republic, it's former Czechoslovakia. So,
Okay.
yeah.
I don't see anybody else raising a hand or something in the chat. We can slowly move towards the straight statements, but I would like to. Perfect. I can see Nevena. Guys, you can send me on the chat to make sure I see everybody, as we said in the beginning. Nevena and then Angela, right?
Yeah.
Very nice. Please go ahead.
Okay, first I enjoyed a lot your speech. I think it was very good and complex. And I think something we should talk about, or question to you now, maybe something we discuss later, is how did this situation change with Corona, so with the pandemic situation? Do you experience yourself that appropriation increased or decreased, or that there was something that was a new experience to you?
I would say that for all of us, what's an experience to discover new kinds of appropriations, right? I think it would be the key word, new. So it's discovering what we can do, what we can't do. So it's about discovering new forms, probably. And new meanings associated to it, right?
I mean, did you experience any special forms of appropriation in Porto? Because in some other cities you had this pop-up bicycle lanes, of course, organized from the public side, but I also experienced some spontaneous forms, where you immediately could see that the people have a limitation of space, of course, in their own apartments. And just as a question, did you experience anything like this in the Corona situation?
Yeah, I think it was common to certain cities. The limitation of cars walking certain streets and transforming streets to pedestrian to improve space for walkability. And we also had that here in Porto, and the bicycles also, but especially for the pedestrians. So the transformation with rules of use. For example, there are some streets here in Porto that on weekends we have more space to use. So there are these car limitation in order to allow people to walk and have more space. So I think that was mainly the main transformation. And in some neighborhoods, when you could do something in your neighborhood, and so you discovered that the collective spaces around buildings can have other uses. But then I don't know if that's about use of, that's about appropriation. That's something that I don't know if for all of you is clear, but for me it's not still clear, the boundary between the use and the appropriation. And it's very, very tricky sometimes, because the appropriation implies this concept that you are taking something for your own purpose, but then does it need kind of this manipulation of the space? That's why I also use the term manipulation, because it's for your own purpose, it's for your own benefit. Do these imply a transformation in the space, or is just using something and where is the boundary of it? Maybe you can help me. I'm not an expert. I'm just giving some ideas for discussion. So maybe you also have some thoughts on this boundary of when it becomes appropriation.
Well, you have to not only establish the boundaries, but also you have to show a signs that the space belongs to you or your group. This is for other group which would like to invade your space. So normally there are established some systems of symbols that tell the other groups that the space is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. Nevena has been very kindly waiting, raising her hand, and Klaski also has a comment afterwards. Dalia, I've seen you, but maybe we can use the time of your response to get back to that. So please, Nevena.
Just want to profit by the cue given from the cue given by Angela, and to get us back to the very beginning, to the linguistic notions, perhaps in the line of appropriation, affirmative, manipulation, and so on, we can just include instrumentalization, because instrumentalization has sort of more neutral, I would say, echo, more neutral sound. You instrumentalize that because you take it and make it useful for your own or collective purposes. Although I am quite aware that instrumentalization sometimes entails political instrumentalization, is very close to that negative echo of manipulation. But I think that perhaps we can include also in, perhaps Sara would know best, whether to include instrumentalization as an overarching term or to stick to more benevolent terms like appropriation.
Sara, would you like to respond, or shall I ask Klaski to add a comment and you can respond all together? What do you prefer? Yeah, Klaski, please. Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on the question of Angela about if the current situation with Corona provokes or challenges new forms of appropriation. In the city of The Hague, where I live, I noticed that now that the bars and restaurants are closed, but it's possible to use takeaway. What restaurants do is to actually move out to the street. So they make a little cover. Now it's autumn, so it's not so pleasant to wait outside, but then they occupy a parking place and make a little cover so that people can order their food and then wait under the cover. And there are some people who have these use these transport bikes and go into the parks and forests to sell coffee and cookies and so on. So there are these forms of appropriation of public spaces or of parks, and to kind of in a kind of creative way deal with these limitations.
Yeah, and Fatma just put it on the chat that in Delft she has noticed that specific crossroads in the city after 9 p.m. become places where young people meet and actually play football. Either the crossroads, also in the public square after 9 p.m. when all the stores close down.
Yeah. That was really interesting because I could observe it, for instance, in Turkey, people are playing, or the youth playing the football on street, or I could have seen it in, I don't know, like on the beach in Rio, the children are playing football, but I think I never seen, I have been here for more than 4 years by now in Delft, but in the historic city center, I've never seen anyone playing football on the street. So this was a really interesting change, as well as I think it's an expression of they cannot use any other sport facilities for their workouts, etc. So just I wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you, Fatma, very much. Sara, if you want to comment, or we can move into the statements and the responses, and we have time for conversation and further comments afterwards.
Yeah, maybe afterwards we can join all contributions. Yeah, I
agree. Thank you very much. Very nice. So we have two very beautiful pairs of statements and responses. We're going to start with Sernaz Alslan from the Istanbul Bigli University, who once again we thank very much for offering her statement, and the response will be from Dalia Milan Bernal from Tampere University of Technology. 5 and 5 minutes, please. We're ready for you guys.
All right, should I start, Angeliki? Perfect. So, urban is the space for encounter, for connection, for play, for learning, for meeting the different, surprise and novelty. And it's easier to talk about appropriation, especially urban appropriation, and rights and claims associated with it, resources associated with it, if you're a white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied, young, well-off individual, and if you do not represent any kind of religious or ethnic minority. If we're going to talk about appropriation as an act of reorientation, as Henry Lefebvre conceptualizes it, we should think that it's actually reorients the urban space, the city, away from its role as an engine of capital accumulation and towards its role as a more constitutive element, more inclusive element in the web of cooperative social relations among urban inhabitants. Then we should ask us the question, what about those who cannot actually appropriate, who are actually deprived of the capability to involve in the act of appropriation? So they are involved in the accumulation of capital part of the urban space, but what about appropriating those urban rights and resources which are provided to us by the urban space itself? I think then we should incorporate the discussion of appropriation within the framework capabilities. So we should actually make the effort to recognize different needs and capabilities of the individuals who are actually the black ships within the society, who do not have access to some kind of very basic privileges like having a able body or having a decent income. So at this point, I think the capabilities approach would provide a different outlet, a broader outlet for the discussion of appropriation. So who are able to appropriate and what should we do for those who are actually not able to appropriate? What are their needs we have been neglecting so far, and what can we do to incorporate those needs, to recognize those needs and actually push the related parties to come up with political agendas regarding urban participation, regarding urban planning, in order to overcome those kind of capabilities. Then we can only think about, then we can only speak about the urban as a place for meaningful interaction where urban inhabitants actually come together and overcome their separation, like different versions of different kinds of separations.
Thank you very much, Sarnaz. Wonderful. Daya, please.
No, I had a presentation. Now I have to talk about that. So let me really quickly contextualize that I'm an architect, and I'm from Mexico. So I'm studying temporary appropriations or temporary uses of vacant and abandoned urban spaces, but within the context of Latin America. And what you bring up to the table actually is really interesting. Who is allowed to appropriate? And I wasn't going to talk about that. And I have to be very honest, because I was very, very inspired by the stories that I follow in Latin America. And these are stories of abandoned spaces that are being taken and transformed into something new. And then there's one particular story that I was able, so I'm studying them in different countries. So I cannot go to those countries, but I do have some in Mexico, and I went to visit them. And I could then see those spaces, those appropriations from another perspective. And then you also have to contextualize in Mexico that you have the prohibition of street vendors appropriating urban space, but then these kind of other appropriations by, let's say, middle-class white people, that is accepted and even now supported. And that was really, for me, almost an identity crisis of who is allowed to do that. But then I realized something. And let me take you a little bit to the spaces where, where my stories be, you know, like I have to share it.
You should be able to share, Dalia.
Yeah, just that I forgot to share because this is so fast. So, you know, these are the spaces where it starts in abandoned plots with rubble from demolished buildings. This is in Mexico City. This is in Argentina. This is in Querétaro, also in Mexico. And this is in San Juan in Puerto Rico. And what I have seen, okay, yes, it is an appropriation by a certain kind of people with certain kind of power and certain kind of even political power, and they have friends in influential positions and whatnot. But what I did find is that they do allow for other people to be part of that. Like, and I didn't have an image of that, but there are, for example, projects where they take an abandoned building and so many people got involved in that they were able to transform a law. And this law now allows any community to take abandoned buildings and use them for their cultural purposes, regardless of what. So I think it's very interesting. Yes, like I said, I was very conflicted with that. Who is allowed to do that? But then I do think that in taking that, in transforming it, the energy it creates around those appropriations is, of course, a political act that can also enable others to participate in activities and even sometimes economic activities that they would otherwise not be able to do. I don't know how much time I still have, but then I would go then to tell.
Have time, don't worry.
So, so I think that appropriation. So, what I found in my research, which helps me further explain the phenomena of temporary uses, is that it's an activation of an unused building or whatever, but it entails an appropriation of that space that is used either by a single or individual groups, single individuals or collective groups, with permission or without. But I think that that appropriation crystallizes with the physical transformation of that space and of the use of that space. And with this transformation, there is a resignification of the meaning of that space. And who appropriates these spaces, what motivates their work, and what do they want to achieve is also an important question. And I wanted to bring this up because it does relate sometimes to the European city, because I have found that there are other forms of appropriation happening here. There is not only the appropriation of space, but also the appropriation of ideas and of discourses. And the majority of the people whose stories I have been collecting have lived abroad, several of them in the European cities, and several of them have found in one way or another inspiration in similar actions taking place in Europe. But to be clear, even if inspired by similar stories, these appropriations take their own form and adapt to their own context. And moreover, by appropriating the space and transforming it and equipping it with activities, they become incredibly meaningful act. So much so that for several people I have interviewed, the appropriation becomes their means of sustenance and their life projects. And it makes them, as one told me, it makes me feel fulfilled and gives meaning to my life. But of course, I've also found this a very big challenge and drawback relating to the now topic of integration, that some of these projects, while some of them really achieve this integration with the communities, where actually in this particular project that I'm showing, it started with one little intervention and then people wanted to continue to transform it other people. So that's what I mean. It started to kind of create an energy around it that then allowed some people to be integrated into something, into a discourse, if you want, of something that otherwise might not have been possible. But
wrapping up and open.
Yeah, and in other cases, well, these have not been able to actually integrate themselves to communities or allow communities to integrate themselves in the project. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Dalia. Wonderful to hear such passionate voices from both of you. Let's move to the second pair of statement and response. Amer Obied from Faculty of Architecture of Lisbon will give a statement. Thank you very much, Amer. And Angela, I'm afraid I'm going to really mispronounce your last name, but please bear with me. Angela Mensiche de Honk from TU Dresden will actually be the responder. Amer, the stage is yours.
Okay. Am I heard well at the beginning?
Very well.
Okay. I was going to share sort of a one-page presentation, but I'm not succeeding, so I think that I will just resort to speaking. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and extend my regards to the speakers before me, because I think that they helped me quite well in making my case, first by presenting concrete cases and tangible cases of space, because I'm not, and second, because they built up the case that I'm trying to argue, which is appropriation, the norm or the normal versus the alien. So I'll start with a poem that is by Ahmed Matar. He says, "They put me in a jar and asked me to fit, but I'm no water. I'm from the clay of heavens, and once I grow, the jar will certainly break." These are the words of the revolutionary Iraqi poet Ahmed Matar. The words strongly and significantly reverberate in today's political, social, and urban landscapes. We may read in between the lines Matar's rejection of the jar, meaning the stereotype, and the embracing of freedom and individuality, as well as willingness to fight rather than yield, and perhaps a certain worry about what is outside the jar, the unknown and untethered. Nonetheless, I believe Matar's existential problem is not in the shape of the jar itself, but with the obligation to fit within it rather than the choice to. It is here and in many other places we assert a similar struggle between the weight of our self-awareness, cultures, ideologies, preferences, appearances, status, and heritage versus the context in which they are perceived, practiced, or simply just present. While on the one hand, some contexts are more tolerable and inclusive, believing in a diversity premised by a culture of acceptance, there are, on the other hand, contexts in which this luxury is absent, and the predominant tendency is for uniformity, even if forced. In both cases, there is a clear need for coexisting and for a place and for a set of rules to govern. Nonetheless, the two are not equal. I argue that the former is a process of integration, in which all parties are participants in creating the normal, and the latter is a process of appropriation, in which one party is pressured and or pursued into forfeiting some or all aspects of their unique definition in order to meet the requirement of the normal. In the light of this argument, I would like to address the specific subtext of appropriation, the normal versus the alien. I believe the normal is but a set of beliefs, appearances, and behaviors, which are accepted and perpetrated by one group of people, and it's fundamentally beneficial to them. The normal is accumulative, inherited, persistent, resistant, comprehensible, predictable, and unchallenging. Anything else is alien. Appropriation in this sense is the change of shape and or meaning of the alien in order to meet the normal, thus posing the dilemma to whether to comply for the pressure and become the normal, or resist and become more alienated and isolated. Of course, the premise of this normal comes with a prior recognition of the power to impose it. This power could be the power of sheer numbers, the power of physical, religious, political, or economic. Needless to say, power defines the normal sustains power. It is in this sense, the normal presents itself as a manner of imposition instead of compromise, tolerance, intolerance instead of tolerance, and moreover, artificial instead of authentic. The water ceases to be water and takes the shape of the jar, in Ahmed's metaphor. Matar, as he was being asked to sing praises for dictatorships, asserts that the notion to appropriate into the appropriate is but an attempt to force a sense of uniformity and homogeneity and normalize the alien. However, while I agree with Ahmed Matar's assertion, and while I'm a firm believer of inclusivity and democracy, I still believe that there is a merit for this understanding of appropriation. For sometimes, meaning and particularity do not fall under virtuosity and moral consensus. Therefore, a change is a must and for the better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amer, very, very much. Angela, please, response from you.
Yes, so I didn't prepare a presentation on my own. I thought I might just listen and react. So just my background, I'm an architect with focus on urban design. And in fact, when I was educated, so in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, appropriation was not a key word while I was studying. So it was more about architect or urban designer as author, as someone who defines, also formally defines the space. And in fact, when I finished studying in the 90s, and also then with the experience of the parts or what was ongoing in Eastern Germany with shrinkage especially, many of the cities in Eastern Germany were losing population, and there we all had to discover that it's not about formally defining a space for people that are not there anymore. So we had to learn that it's about actors that you have to convince to be part of the city, to stay in the city, and of course then it became a strategy of appropriation. I mean, this was really then becoming a keyword, and before nothing, at least not in my experience of studying. And I think what is problematic, if I look, for example, in the case of Dresden, I mean, I'm from the western part of Germany, I studied in Darmstadt, I moved to Berlin in the 90s, and I became a professor in Dresden, so in the former eastern part of Germany, in the year 2000. At that time, Dresden was a city or one of the capitals of shrinkage. And at that time, the administration became open for appropriation, any kind of temporary use on open spaces where there was no use. But now, or since maybe 10, 15 years, we are a city that is growing. And of course, it's again about real estate, about money. And something that you discover also in Berlin is that this city-centered development becomes less and less. And this is something I would like to discuss also with you. And then this question, if Corona maybe enables a new way of appropriation or makes things possible, experiments possible that were not possible anymore in a dynamic, in a positive dynamic regarding real estate. So these are some things that would be interesting to me in my point of view. And of course, I think this question that Sara already posed, this question of laissez-faire or règlement, I mean, it's a very difficult situation for an architect or designer to define it. So where to open it, or from a point of aesthetics, also where to define things that should remain. If you really think of not only a temporary use over some days where nothing remains, but if things remain, how to deal with it and putting it into a timeline. So this is, I think, an important issue to discuss. Yeah. And of course, if we talked about many, or most of us are from bigger cities, but I think the issue of appropriation and representing really different citizens is a crucial issue in smaller towns. If you have many cities, many identities within a city, of course, you could choose where to go. But if you have a smaller town with just one market square, one park, of course, this kind of overlapping interest could become more a conflict situation, or at the end you have to deal out or to deal with a compromise that serves all. So just as a statement from my side.
Thank you, Angela, very much. Perfect on the spot response and perfect time. Thank you very, very much. We can enjoy the next half hour on an open discussion on those wonderful statements and responses, also on the keynote. Who would like to start? There's already many questions asked by the people who gave the statements and the responses and the keynote. Don't let me start talking because I can talk forever. So please, somebody else takes the stage. Please, Dalia.
I just wanted to even question the other, the last speaker, I didn't write her name, about temporary uses like not remaining there. And I guess it also links to what Sernas was commenting about who is able to use what, but I do think that even if the appropriation itself, the physical transformation might not exist anymore, there are things that remain, and exactly that's what I meant with, okay, from some of the projects that I follow, they lose their energy, but then but there's something left there that might not be physical, that might be some other form of transformation, and in some cases it might be transforming the law, or then transforming ideas or generating ideas that will be transmitted elsewhere, and then those transformations kind of stay there, not physically in the space, but something they can catalyze some sort of other change. So I would question that the idea that temporary uses don't remain, they're too ephemeral to remain, I guess, and then how they enable others to then also act elsewhere or whatever. I just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, thank you, Dalia. Klaske.
Yes, well, first to continue on what Dalia was saying about temporary uses, indeed, this is sometimes also a kind of use or almost misuse of appropriation, where it's supported or institutionalized. I myself worked as architect on the ship wharf in Amsterdam that I know Pablo was studying a few months ago, where former ship wharf was turned into a kind of creative hub to catalyze the area. And this was a moment for a lot of creative makers and artists and youth community of Amsterdam, the skaters, to appropriate that place and to be given that place to appropriate, but for a temporary period. And indeed, the question is if that was a problem, that now they are gradually moving out and the power of real estate is coming in, but indeed it does create new meaning to the place. It does create social encounters, and it does also create some kind of understanding of these different social groups. So there's indeed this kind of ambiguity to temporary uses and the use of appropriation almost as a strategy, as Angela was also saying, that happened in Dresden. They're used, and at the same time they're also used to kind of capitalize on this area to make it popular and then well, ready for further speculation. The other thing I wanted to address is Sara in her lecture ended with this notion of narratives, that appropriation is also about writing our own stories and creating narratives through the city. Then Angela brought up this idea of dealing with actors, that at this moment of the shrinking cities, it's maybe not so much about the architect or urban designer being the author, but about understanding maybe the social resource of these actors that have different capacities and different professions, but that in some kind of way you want to activate a certain group and allow them to appropriate. And I thought there was a beautiful link between, on the one hand, this idea of stories, and on the other hand, the actors. If we think of a story, there's always the protagonists and the actors that are connected to the space and to activity. So I thought there was this link to our interest in narratives and stories that don't exist without protagonists and without actors, and that we have to be, of course, we have to depart from space, as Saskia was saying. What are these spaces? Which kind of spaces are appropriable? Are these the found spaces or the liminal spaces or the open spaces or open-ended spaces, as Sara was suggesting? But on the other hand, we have to also think about the actors that appropriate.
Would anybody like to respond on that, either from Sara or, yes, Manjula, please.
Yes, maybe. So Angela is just the first name to make it easier. No, I think that's really an important point of view, and one could really say that during the time of shrinkage, this question of how to activate people to do something with a space, not to leave it just empty, was or became one of the most important tool. And of course, on the other hand, if it worked out in some of the cities gained inhabitants again, it became this issue of gentrification. And this is, of course, something where you have to set some limits again. This is at least my observation with the time and the change, that it becomes a crucial issue. And I didn't say that there shouldn't be anything left from a temporary use, just in contrast, but this question of how to deal with it, how to make it a kind of drama with different acts or sequences, that also not one intervention makes it impossible for another group to have their freedom to appropriate the space.
Yeah,
Please.
That's something we have in common with Eastern Germany. We have a lot of these prefabricated panel buildings, which is a problem. But around these buildings, there's a lot of public space, and nobody takes care about it. So we tried in the 90s and early in this century to try to appropriate the space to the people, to make it semi-private, which helps. They defend the space, which is quite good for the security and safety. So appropriation in this sense is very good to do this. But Germany is a little bit richer, so some of those houses were abandoned. But we in Czech Republic, we have to take care about all these houses, because we have in big cities, we have a crisis. So we try to make some kind of revitalization and remodelation of this building. So it was successful. I have some people like it, or those people who live there now, they like it, the way we did it.
Thank you, Karel. Any other comments or answers? Saskia, your hand? Yeah, please, Sara, and then Saskia.
Okay, just to add something on what Klask said about the stories. Yeah, when those homeless use that corner of the street, they are writing their own story. Their story of their life has a part that took place there. And so that's the story for them. And that's the story that also prevails in the city. And that's what I say when I bring the stories. It's like you are writing something on the space. Also adding to what Dalia was presenting about the informal and temporary interventions, and that I also brought these kind of pop-ups and interventions that sometimes are more planned and not so spontaneous. They use they have this purpose of resolving or dealing with some problems. They transform physically the space, as you were saying, and this is something that probably is part of the appropriation process, is to transform physically the space. But more than that, and that's why probably I choose the 3 keywords for my presentation. There is this physical transformation, but there is also this manipulation in terms of the purposes that you give to that transformation. So it's more than being only transformative, it's also manipulative. It's to manipulate and give a certain purpose when you transform it, either if it is only for your own use and your own purpose, either if it is for a collective purpose. And besides all that, it's also to give the meaning, and that is something that Cruz presented so well in the first part. But here, how do we give a significance to that transformation, and how do we link each other to the place And that's the last one, the affective side. So how can you give some meaning, and the meaning and the significance that you put in that transformation? I think it's also essential for the appropriation.
Saskia, please.
Yes, well, it's just some thoughts going through my head, and I'm not sure whether I can word it correctly, but it's going on to what Klaske said, and also what was discussed in the earlier discussion of this morning, the relation to meaning, because it seems the way I always thought about appropriation, and also what comes from what most of you have said, is as soon as we think about physical transformation of the space, we think about use. So Sara was also saying, well, I'm not sure when I should talk about appropriation or when I should talk about use. So it's very rarely then anymore about meaning. And so I still find it, this morning it was totally clear for me that of course you cannot distinguish meaning from appropriation. And now suddenly it becomes a little bit unclear, because if we start to talk about appropriation, we start to talk about use, about pedestrians versus cars, about people playing, using a table to play chess. So then it becomes very pragmatic almost. Appropriation has a lot to do with pragmatics. Klaske was saying, well, of course we talk about physical space, but we should also think about the people who, and then again we can start talking about meaning again, what meaning people give to a place. And I'm still kind of missing, and not missing from the discussion, but missing in general, how can the physical qualities of the landscape to be appropriated say something about the meaning that can be derived from it and that is related to this appropriation. So it's a bit still unclear. So I still feel that there is some kind of gap. Yeah, just wanted to put that on the table.
Saskia, as you were talking, I was wondering, maybe that ties up, because I also had a question based on what Sara told me, and Sernas, right away I'm giving you the speech. Maybe the answer is to the other side of appropriation that Sara talked about, hinted on, but we didn't really go into further depth. It's not only our appropriation of public space in whatever capacity, but also is the appropriation of space on us, how the city appropriates us, right, Sara? I think that's how you mentioned it. And I think that's something Michael also brought up 2 weeks ago when we were having the internal group. So in this idea of the meaning that is, we endow something with meaning, or the meaning that is already endowed on us. Mm-hmm. And this double think of the appropriation, which goes back to the classic phenomenological argument that I think different thoughts when I walk in Paris than when I walk in Athens, because the city appropriates us. And that's a part that really fascinates me a lot in my own research, Sara. And I don't know if the answer is somewhere there. Sara pointed in both options of appropriation, but so far we have been focusing mostly on our appropriation mm-hmm. of the built environment, and not how the built environment appropriates us. Sernas has asked to have a word, and then right away, the next Italo. Please, Sernas.
I was going to say about what Saskia has just mentioned. I think appropriation is way beyond the concept of use. It's not only about use, it's about, I think, being able to make claims regarding urban rights, like to be represented at urban level, to have a say in urban planning, to let's say have your voice heard in, let's say, decision-making procedures. And it's also about urban resources. And when I say urban resources, like, I'm a social scientist, I'm a political scientist, therefore I maybe have a different conceptualization, I don't know. But when I think of urban resources, it's actually what the urban space provides us. It ranges from, let's say, education to have an urban belonging, to feel like an urbanite. And I think appropriation is a very inclusive term when we think of it like this. So it's way beyond use. It's not only about like using stone tables as chessboards or being comfortable in the streets. I think it's more complex than that. And I don't know, when we think of this making claims, being able to make claims and having your voice heard kind of conceptualization, it also comes again very much to the meaningfulness and meaning, because if we don't feel that we're not able to make claims, then we cannot make sense of our built environment, our urban environment. So it's, I think, very much linked to each other in that sense.
Saskia, you have to respond. Would like to respond, or I can give the word to Italo? And then...
No, thanks. I just
okay.
Yeah.
Italo, please, you want to add on the conversation?
Yes, thank you. I would like to add on this conversation again with the idea of time that Sara mentioned at the beginning, and also because I think, and I like your notice of two different cities, the city of Paris and the city of Athens, that they have a total different feeling of appropriation. And I think the sense of time is therefore really important, that every city has its own dynamics in the routines that happen. So I think the city of Athens has a way different atmosphere because of the activity that repetitions itself. And the activities that come back over time, daily or weekly or yearly, give this different atmosphere to a city, and therefore also generate meaning. So a city where a certain activity happens every week, this activity gets meaning because it happens every week. And I think that's important to me, at least, for the idea of appropriation and what is meaningful. That, yeah, the idea of time then.
Thank you very much, Italo.
So you're saying, Italo, that the site specificity of cities not only has to do with the, let's say, physical dimensions and climate and so on, but also with the activities that take place, or the habits, everyday life, the patterns of everyday life.
Yes, certainly. Especially if you see the city as a group of components, like the street and the square and maybe some public buildings, that every component has its own use. Like the street will be used continuously by people, but the square can be used for a big part of the day, barely, but then at the end of the day, everyone gathers there to meet at the end of the day. So yeah.
Wonderful. We have a few more minutes. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, it's just continuing thinking now. I was thinking earlier about somebody of you, I have no idea who said, well, appropriation is maybe a difficult term. Maybe we should think about instrumentalization. Maybe that's where I got hooked on. Now it starts to use, too much focused on use. And then when Santos was replying to my difficulties, so to say, I thought, well, maybe we are talking more about a sense of belonging than about appropriation, because it's also what Italo was now saying. It's not really about changing the space, but about the feeling, and also what Santos was saying, the right to the city. So it is more about feeling that you have the right to be here, or that you belong somewhere, that the space gives you. And it doesn't have to be translated into literally physically changing a space. Is that maybe more?
Can I say something?
Yes, please, Sara.
I think it's once again about exchange. If you look at it that way, Saskia, if it is only the sense of belonging, it's only the city that is giving something to you. But when we speak about appropriation, I believe it's about exchange. So you are also giving something to the city. And that's why it has to be both ways.
Yeah, but I think when I say belonging, I actually mean that you can only feel this sense of belonging if you are related to, it's never one-way traffic. Yes.
Maybe Sara gave some definitions where she paired the word appropriation with another one, like cultural appropriation, urban appropriation. Isn't a kind of appropriation we're speaking about some kind of socio-spatial appropriation, that is a transformation or occupation or new use of space, but that is intricately related with social groups. I don't know, Sara, you are one of the...
Now I'm confused, sorry.
No, I was wondering, you said urban appropriation or cultural appropriation, but perhaps the kind of appropriation...
Oh, okay, yeah. Another one, yeah.
Social spatial appropriation.
Yeah. Although urban appropriation should include these social constructions, so so it should be there. Right.
Yeah, maybe a subcategory of this urban appropriation then.
Yeah, we should think about categories there, probably.
Yeah, but when you start when you start talking about social groups, it's again this kind of, this group does this and this group does that and that group does that. Whereas with this, I don't know whether belonging is a good term, but then it doesn't really matter whether you belong to this group or to many different groups, or it is less kind of socially divided. I mean, I can feel like there is this kind of place here in the neighborhood that I feel very much like my own. So that is what I could imagine is appropriation is about, although I never do something there. It's just that, you know, I feel attached to that place. I go there sometimes, but I don't change it. And it's not me as, well, of course, I'm always part of a certain group, but I'm also part of other kind of social groups. It's more me as an individual that feels attached to this place. Isn't that also what it is about?
To me, Saskia, when you mentioned the term of belonging, I actually thought that Sara would jump in and saying, I very much like the refinement in terms of the exchange, but I also helps what Sara said about differentiating use with appropriation. Because if just as a tourist, I use the place, I go around, I don't necessarily feel I belong, like that place I use as tourist belongs to me. But if the skate border, maybe this place belongs to me from 9 to 11 p.m. or during even later times. And maybe the belonging also includes the element of time that Sara put on the table at the very end of her keynote. Like so that because the belonging through particular times allows for this kind of exchange. I don't know if all these three can come together in relation to what we have been discussing so far. I will leave you all with this question for your coffee break. I cannot thank you enough for being so energized after lunch and having so many things to share and discuss about appropriation, a particularly challenging term. Sara, thank you so much for a wonderful keynote. Thank you very much for the beautiful statements and the beautiful responses by all of you. At 3 o'clock, we will be back for the third session of the